Welcome to Clear Mountain Monastery's Wednesday evening live stream. Today we're here with Jonas Mago. Jonas Mago is a cognitive neuroscientist whose research explores contemplative practices designed to cultivate wholesome states of mind, spanning meditation, prayer, collective cultural rituals, and psychedelic therapies. He approaches these topics from an interdisciplinary perspective, integrating cognitive science, neurobiology, computational modeling, and phenomenology to investigate mechanisms of self-regulation and transformation. He is currently pursuing his doctoral studies in neuroscience at McGill University. His current research into the neuroscience of jhāna meditation focuses on the neurophysiology mechanisms underlying jhāna states, working with expert meditators in North America, Myanmar, Thailand, and India. Using fMRI, EEG, and computational modeling, he's working to develop a comprehensive neurocomputational model that elucidates how these states emerge, their underlying mechanisms, and their impact on other cognitive functions. And I'm surprised I made it through that without stumbling through at least like a few of those words. So go me. Jonas, it's so good to have you on.
Thank you so much for the incredibly kind invitation and introduction. What a big intro. And I hope that we can unpack some of that in the minutes to an hour to come.
We first heard Jonas speaking on John Vervaeke's podcast, and our friend Ajahn Kevin put him in contact with us, and he joined all the way from Montreal 3 hours later than us. So yeah, we're very grateful, Jonas, and the research you're doing is fascinating. So people can feel free to type things into the chat, but we'll ask some questions and hopefully unpack some of that bio.
Great. Yeah, please take it away.
So I think one of the first things is just asking about kind of a broad overview of the research you're doing into jhāna states. And I know this is a big, but just to get context, the research and the conceptual models that you're using to think about jhāna.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a word first about the conceptual models that kind of contextualize my research and my interest in this world. One of the most stunning findings over the past 10, 20 years in research on the brain and perception is a reversal of how perception seems to work. For a long, long time, there was the idea that perception is we get information through our eyes and ears and nose and skin, and then we slowly build up meaning from that. Like in the eyes, we see like all these little pixels, like with our watts and cones, we have small information. And out of that, we build up more and more complex meaning to notice that, like figure out that if I have a cup, to kind of put all the visual input together to make it a cup. And more recently, there's been a shift in the terms there are predictive processing or the Bayesian brain hypothesis, where what we found is that the brain spends a lot more energy with predicting and expecting what we expect to see. So a lot more of what perception actually is this constant anticipation of what we think we see. And the actual data that's coming in is only a small fraction of what makes up the complexity of consciousness. And if that is true, then there is a huge door that is opening to the subjectivity of perception of consciousness that basically emphasizes how important it is to not only change the world and the objects around us, but refine the attitude, make the attitude how we perceive these objects, make that an attitude of beauty, of creativity, of playing, how we want to perceive. And that is the big door of how I got interested in doing research on contemplative practices, being deeply interested in how are these 1,000-year-old traditions, how are they thinking about that process of refining perception? And what is it to have a good or beautiful perception? And since then, I've been on the search to speak to different communities. And one of them that has been deeply inspiring is meditators practicing so-called jhāna states, which is like a very beautifully, clearly defined state of deep absorption accompanied by joy. And I see those as one example for how we are able to change perception in a deeply meaningful way.
curious, Ajahn Nisabho mentioned 3 different, I guess, testing apparatus that you use. So fMRI, EEG, and computational models. And I'm curious if you could unpack those for people that don't know what are these tools and what can they measure, and how do you use them in your research on meditators?
Yeah.
And do you mind if we make you large, Jonas? Oh, the opposite.
Please do.
Okay, second, I see what. There we go.
You might just move that around whatever ways you like. Okay, so I would put together fMRI and EEG. So these are the most classical research tools in neuroscience. So fMRI are these incredibly big magnets that you lay on and you kind of, you move into it. It's often used to, like if you have a fracture or break something, it's kind of like an X-ray machine, but different. Same, different. And you get these beautiful spatial resolved maps of the brain. And if people ever saw any neuroscience research, you see these brains with different blobs, like red or blue blobs, where you see like where in the brain is something happening. And EEG are these almost like caps, like here in Montreal, like imagine like a big winter cap with all kinds of little electrodes coming out of them, which is a measuring tool that is really good in measuring what is happening temporally. So how is the information unfolding over time? So both of these give us a sense of like what is happening physically in the brain. But now there's a big explanatory gap between this and the phenomenology, the lived experience, where lived experience is not defined by a specific location in the brain or by a specific frequency. And there's this explanatory gap between data and experience. And over the past few years, there's a longer tradition, but more recently, a re-emergence of trying to use computational simulation to bridge these two fields. And the idea is that the computational simulation can be inspired by what we find from the measurements, but simulations are dynamic, and the dynamic unfolding of how information is moving in these simulations can be a representation or a simulation of what experience might be like. And so the hope is that with these more advanced computational models, we can close this gap between actual experience and data that we find a bit more, and then triangulate the measures, the simulations, and the lived experience into one triangle that is ideally coming closer and closer together.
So in terms of those three converging into a hypothesis or model for experience, well, how would you, maybe you could spell out a little more, describe in more detail what the exact, or some of the exact research you've been doing around these jhana states. I know you've been working with disciples of Shaila Catherine, as well as veteran practitioners and even monastics in Thailand and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And what have you found?
So one of the central questions that I've been sitting with in this research is, like, of course, what characterizes these jhana states, but more interestingly, jhanas are not only unique in their experience, but they often are considered in the context of awakening or liberation or insight. That somehow these certain concentration states have a larger impact in recognizing something about experience more globally. And one of the key questions in this research is, can we identify certain markers that are indicative of transitions of cognition, are indicative of a malleability of cognition and of perception and of brain activity? And so one of the questions we went into is to look at a measure called entropy or surprise, where we basically ask the question, how rigid is the brain following a certain structure that has been entrained over and over again? Or how flexible is it, allowing it to adapt in new ways, in like unpredictable ways, in novel ways? And what we find is that when we compare jhana meditation to kind of more classical mindfulness of breathing meditation, that in jhana, where there's more concentration, there's more absorption, it's a more advanced practice, we find that these indicators of flexibility, adaptability, surprisal are increasing. And like the more technical term would be entropy. And so you find that in most areas of the brain, this very marker of entropy is very strongly increasing, which is for us a sign that it's one first step towards understanding how or why these jhana states might have this effect of some insight, some change in perception that might result from them.
Yeah, I'm curious. So Ajahn, Nisabho mentioned that some of the teachers that you've been studying with and working with are in this Pa'ak Sayadaw tradition.
Yeah.
And just as a bit of background for people who are watching, I think a lot of teachers, authors these days, Richard Shankman in The Experience of Samādhi talks about this distinction between Sutta jhana, so the jhanas that you find in the oldest strata of the Pali Canon, with Visuddhimagga jhanas. And this is the jhanas are deep absorptive meditations that are found in the Visuddhimagga, some 400, 500 AD. And the Pa'ak tradition, which I stayed at a monastery in their tradition in Thailand, which you also stayed at, really lean quite heavily into this Visuddhimagga jhana, which is a lot deeper state of concentration, absorption, immersion. And it's because it's more difficult, it's more refined, it's more, the parameters with which they define these different jhana factors are much more specific. There are a lot fewer people who can actually attain these jhanas. So yeah, curious if you could talk about your selection process and how you were able to determine when someone's in jhana, how you're measuring these things. If you're looking at the individual jhana factors.
So I would even zoom a step further out. You mentioned this debate between two different types of jhana. A bit further zooming out is the question, how important is jhana in the mindfulness path in general? And if you zoom even a step further out, there's the question of how unique are these Buddhist approaches to practices of mind? Like, what about the Christian centering prayer? You have a practice that also involves a lot of concentration, also has a quality of devotion, and also has a quality of change, of cognitive change coming with it. And so while I myself have most experience in these Buddhist practices, exploring them myself, I at the end need to lift my hands. I haven't practiced enough of these different traditions to really know which of these actually works, and there's a question of what working actually means. So there's I think I come from this perspective where I'm pretty careful to prioritize a certain tradition over another tradition. And yet, doing research on one, I need to kind of decide one tradition to actually be able to get some insights. And there's something really, really beautiful working in the Buddhist tradition, which is there is a incredible refined way of speaking about the lived experience. There's such a refined vocabulary that has been evolved over hundreds and thousands of years. So that makes the Buddhist tradition like a beautiful context to study, to both understand meditation, but to understand what human consciousness and cognition is like more generally. And then zooming in a bit more into the jhana practices, one of the problems is meditation can be so many things. There's concentration practices, there's open monitoring practices, there's non-dual practices, there's insight practices. You can do the insight practice on all these different sense modalities. And so for me as a researcher, it becomes incredibly helpful to have people that are very specific in the practice they do. And so there's always like a looking of like, who is the teacher and the students that are like very precise around the kind of practices they do. And so this is one reason why jhana becomes really, really interesting as a subject of study, because there's very clearly defined practices, very clearly defined factors, from the nimitta to the jhana factors to the progression through the jhanas. And then amongst the traditions that teach this, the Park Sayadaw tradition, and in North America taught by Shala Catherine, is the tradition that in my experience has been most rigorous in that classification, which excludes many other people that might do similar practices, but the scope of who we consider jhana practitioners is therefore very small. Is that therefore like a better practice or so? I don't know. I think that's a question that's much more like debate amongst practitioners. But yeah, it's this beautiful refinement of language that is deeply beautiful there.
Thank you, Jonas. And so kind of dovetailing off of that, mapping on, you talked about one of the primary conceptual models you're using being predictive processing of the brain. How do you see jhana states conceived of through predictive processing? I think in one of your interviews, you talk about how the object becomes so simple that the mechanisms of predictive processing themselves become available to sort of refine and see. And how does that lead to insight in a predictive modeling conception?
Yeah. I love that question. So here it slowly starts the territory where I make claims that, like, where we can debate how true these claims are. But what I think is really beautiful is if we take this predictive processing model, we have experience that comes in, and we have our anticipation of it that makes up much more of experience. And one way of understanding what insight might be is to recognize the profound dominance of our own anticipation in the kind of makeup of experience. That at the end, it's not so much the actual world that we experience, but that it's our attitude, approach to the world that we experience. And so now the question is like, how can we observe this process? And usually with so much data coming in, it's almost like we kind of, the model is so active that it's a really complex phenomena. And complex phenomena are just difficult to observe. And so one way of how I think of what jhana meditation is doing is it is so utterly reducing this process where both my anticipations, expectations become simpler and simpler and simpler. And because they become simpler, the actual emergent experience becomes simpler. It's not that the world around you is changing, but while usually we kind of try to make sense of everything, we try to only make sense of the breath at the nose. At some point, the physical experience of the breath is still too distracting. So we only try to make sense of the imagined breath, which is now like, it's even subtler. Out of this nimitta emerges, which is this mental light phenomena, which is, it is such a small subset of what experience is. But we kind of reduce our anticipation until the reality model, which is like the whole computational structure, becomes so simple that now once this one's automatic, once we can let go of effort, we can now start observing this inferential process, this emergent phenomena. And it now becomes much easier because the process itself is so much simpler. Could we do the observing in everyday experience? Sure, but the phenomena itself, the perceptual phenomena, is so much more complex that it probably becomes a much harder task. And then, so that's the one way the process is simple. And the other way, which I think is often neglected when I speak about these jhana states, the suttas or the scriptures, they speak of the awakening happening not in the jhana, but right afterwards, when the Buddha came out of these jhana states. And now imagine if your perceptual model is super simple, and now you stop the meditation, and now you slowly notice how perception is built up again. You notice how slowly time comes back, space comes back, self-identity comes back. And now you can observe how all these things that you usually take for granted, for normal, for given, how they are now emerging in experience. And in this process of seeing them re-emerge, you can notice that they are not given, not always, not constant, but that they are a certain kind of quality that is dependent upon your like attitude or like your approach to how you perceive usually.
Yeah, in your interview with John Vervaeke, he used a word that I had to look up a couple of times, sapiential, which basically apparently just means having to do with insight or wisdom.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that, his framing of it in that way, and your framing of it as this practice of jhana, this practice of concentration is in a Buddhist context within this larger landscape of training in all these other things. I'm curious if you could talk about integrating the science of the third person. So we've talked about these different measures. You can use an EEG cap, or you can put somebody in an fMRI machine, all these different neuroscience tools, checking people's pulse, breath, whatever, with the science of the first person, the phenomenology, what people are actually experiencing firsthand. And how do you bridge that seeming hard problem?
One of the scholars that, if people are interested in this, there's a scholar called Francisco Varela, and he talks about neurophenomenology, which is exactly this interaction of the two spaces. And for me, there is a humbleness that comes in here, where ultimately the phenomenology part is a part that I will never be able to explain from the outside in a way that is truer than what is actually lived. And so here's the part where I just need to trust the meditators. So what we do is we take all the measures, but then we have questions where it's like, how good was this jhana? How stable was it? Were you deep in a jhana? Were you subtle in a jhana? Was there a lot of distraction, little distraction? And so there it's just up to the meditators reporting what they experience. But then more important than just the scales is we sit with every meditator an hour or 2 or 3 afterwards, and we just listen to what they experience, and we try to pull out themes, like certain common themes that are emergent amongst different meditators. And one of the themes that we found in this jhana research is that there are 3 types of experience that seem very common amongst others, but these are attention, arousal, and release. There's something where you like focus the attention, then there's like an arousal of like pity, of like intensity rising, and somehow that then falls into a release, into a softening, into an opening. And so now we have these 3 terms, and now we could look back into the data and see, can we find markers of these qualities? Can they help us to now interpret the data? And so this process of forth and back, it might be that we now find something in the data where we want to go back to the meditators and ask them. And so it becomes, I would almost say, like an artistic process of going forth and back.
It's it gives me great appreciation for the clarity of the tradition that those 3 terms map so well onto ekagata, piti and sukha, arousal and release into pleasure. That's I don't know if it's an exact mapping, but it's pretty beautiful. And I did want to also ask sort of it's a question with 2 routes you could take. I have been impressed in your interviews how you've talked about the importance of not divorcing these states from the wider context of sila, ethics, and a tradition and a worldview. And I think even, and I'm curious if you would, if this is what you were saying, that the mind being in such a malleable state, it's especially important to kind of hold it within a container. So I'm curious how you conceive of that relationship between samadhi and sila, or a framing.
Yeah.
And then at some point, I would like to hear how you've interacted with that as well, because I know you're a practitioner and you've interacted with these really impressive beings, but one thing at a time. So
Love that. I'll go with the first one. There's two things I want to say, and I hope you remember the second one, but let's see. The one thing you already mentioned it is, and I think it's a really big point, and it's maybe the most important point that comes out of this research, that when we're in these states of heightened concentration, where our reality model is reduced to something so simple, where now in the next step, the model of reality is re-emerging, where there's meaning making happening. We have a chance to reinterpret how we want to relate to the world. Marked by high entropy, or these states of like malleability of the brain, they're truly malleable. We're truly susceptible to now build up new stories that are likely influenced by our context, by what our peers are doing, by the culture we're in. I think that's true how we grow up as kids, as young adults. But the same cultural influence is there every time we re-emerge from these states of heightened flexibility and adaptability, which is, I think, both beautiful. We're now able to create ways of relating to the world that's more beautiful, that's more awe-inspiring, that's more exciting, more alive. But in principle, we could create any other reality model as well. Like this process of perception and consciousness being largely inspired by our attitude, by our by our automatic way of creating that model, we could just end up creating a terrible model, a model that is filled with utter despair. We could create a model where we perceive everything being a possible attack on us, where the world is inherently bad and trying to just kind of get us and whatever. This is more and more the idea of how we understand things like depression or anxiety, that you're stuck in a model of the world that isn't really adaptive. And so there's the idea of like, how well are you doing? But there's also the question, the model you have, how is it impacting the social and cultural context? How is it impacting the environment? How is it impacting people you love and those you don't love? And this becomes a highly complex process. And either you have strong enough of a metacognition that you can monitor all these things, which I think is possible, or you can trust that the culture or the community around you is helping you, is giving you feedback, is letting you know, hey, how are you doing? Am I doing okay? Is it okay how I show up? And that's where I think friends, where community, where Sangha becomes so, so important. And I think that's the one big point. And the other big point that's somewhat related is often in the Park Sayadaw tradition, the emergence of jhāna, of piti, is indicated as a marker of right concentration, of like right attitude, of right livelihood. You could, of course, try to crank up piti more mechanically. If I do really strong kind of breath work and dance and ecstatic practices, maybe even take psychedelics, then of course I can ramp up a piti-like experience really strongly. But because it isn't emerging naturally, it's actually not an indicator of all these other factors going well. And so while I think it is interesting and important to think about how can we make these states of joy and happiness accessible to more, there's also this subtle questioning of, is it valuable to crank up these states of deeper absorption, malleability, if it doesn't happen naturally, which is an indication that the ground is ripe for kind of these transformative processes? And again, I don't know what's the right answer here, but it's it's a question I'm sitting with.
That's such a respectful and humble and careful answer. Thank you, Jonas.
I'm curious, you mentioned metacognition and, focused awareness, attention, of which Samādhi and jhāna, and especially these pā'ak jhanas, are this focused awareness of, a very particular breed of this focused awareness, attention, meditation. And I mean, one possible criticism I've heard of these very deep Visuddhimagga jhanas is that it's so deep and the experience is so rarefied that you're actually not developing so much metacognition, that you're just so deep. I mean, you're getting a lot of very local metacognition about the extreme particulars of the breath at a very particular point, for instance. But what has been your experience, either personally or with these deep meditators, the relationship between going into these very deep jhanas and the metacognition, spacious, overarching awareness and maybe even insights?
It's I feel like it's a sensitive question again, because now the question is like kind of almost judging how the tradition works, and yet I think it's an important question to sit with. And I do think there's a very common, like the general academic trend moves towards metacognition being a very important tool to develop, possibly more important than the attention itself. Where attention might just be a means towards developing metacognition, whatever metacognition is, like an awareness of larger experiential processes. How do I perceive it in Shaila Catherine and Park Sayadaw traditions and in the jhana community at large? I do find I went in with the same worry or questioning almost, right? Like almost it's like, how is this relevant for larger path of awakening, liberation, of a diverse practice background? Because in some ways, I think there's a possible danger here of hiding away from actual experience by kind of hiding into these very unique hidden states. But when I speak with some of these teachers, what I often hear is the emphasis on not staying in these states for necessarily super long, but training explicitly going into them and then coming out, reflecting on them. How has the state impacted my cognition at large? And then going back in and then coming back out. And so while the state itself might have very little metacognition, possibly even none, especially in deep absorption, there is just no meta framework. What I've encountered is a big focus on the moment when you come out and the reflection and the reflections that follow there.
Thank you for that. Very circumspect response as well. I mean, I haven't met Shaila myself, but have been very impressed with her teachings and with the monks at these pā'ak monasteries who I met, who the practice was really obviously working very well for. They were coming out of these very deep states. These are monks, who I'm seeing, 3 times a day meditating for 3 hours without getting up, and then they get up and they're smiling and doing well, and really virtuosos. But it really,
and just riffing on this, and when I was in Asia and trying to interact with these communities and think about if and how we could do research there, it's stunning to see these monks in these 3-month retreats where they are just and longer, right? Where for a long time they really go deep, and we tried to work with some and even thought of what measures could we take, and often we want to compare a certain state of concentration to other states. And some of the monks were like, at this period of practice, I really just want to do this deep shamatha concentration practice. That really is what serves. And for a time being, I don't really want to distract myself with these other practices. So I think there's a deep, it can go really far how deep some of these practitioners focus on these states. Yeah.
So Jonas, I think we've rarely had so many questions in the chat, so we might keep you on the YouTube live stream a few minutes even longer than we thought.
Please do. Yeah.
But I did have one question before we go to the chat questions,
Yeah.
and that was, how do you conceive of the refinement of perception and the entropy emerging from jhana states in meditation, as opposed to that which emerges from psychedelic therapies?
Yeah.
And do you see, you know, I mean, obviously with the fifth precept, we're, you know, wary of intoxicants and all that is, but yeah, how do you conceive of these two pathways which have both become so talked about recently?
Totally. Yeah, and I think the thing that might have been implicit in what I said is these measures of entropy, they're very famous for having been developed in the psychedelic space. Like psychedelics have been the one substance that increased this measure of entropy very significantly. And so we kind of realized that similar processes happen in jhana meditation, in these Buddhist practices. I think there's a similarity. There's a similarity here that both these practices seem to be able to let go of certain perceptual narratives that have been dominating our experience from before. I think both people that meditate a lot and both people that take psychedelics, if you ask them, have you had an experience that is significantly different from how you perceived reality before? I think both camps would probably say yes, given that the psychedelic doses is high enough or the meditative practice has been strong enough. That's the one part, and that's often called as the deconstruction phase. The deconstruction is deconstructing certain models. But then there's the reconstruction phase. So given we now notice that perception is somewhat more malleable, what do we do with it? How do we re-emerge? Because like we could either just keep taking psychedelics for the rest of our lives or stay in deep jhana absorption for the rest of our lives. Both wouldn't really allow you to interact with the world very much. Like even as meditators, we kind of re-engage in the world and kind of compromise a certain state of depth and concentration to interact. And so there's this re-emergence. And now the question is like, what does it take to re-emerge beautifully? And in my experience so far, it's neither concentration practice nor psychedelics that really guide this re-emergent process. I think we need a new set of practices and we need a new set of like science around it. Like so far, so much of the science has focused on this, how do we get out? Like think of much of the therapy with depression and psychedelics is how do we get people out of this depression? But very little is talked of how do we then reintegrate narratives that are actually wholesome and beautiful. And so I think that's something that requires metacognition, to reflect on how are you actually doing in context. That requires context and community. That requires a skillful practice of like re-emerging with parts, then going back into the subtle space, re-emerging, going back, re-emerging, like this back and forth. Can that exist in the psychedelic space? I think it can. Is it always existing? I don't think so. And that's where I think these Buddhist practices are very unique, that jhana practice is deeply embedded in other practices that help with the re-emergence. There's the Eightfold Path, there is Sangha, there's Shila and kind of the idea of like setting up the practitioner to be in a path that once you come to these moments of malleability, that the momentum from having lived a certain way will carry you through and actually allow you to come out more beautifully and not end up in states of psychosis or states of like overwhelm, which can happen in psychedelics, which also can happen in meditation. If people go on a 10-day meditation retreat, have never meditated before, you get such a strong dose of reconfiguration that maybe you don't have the setting and context that is actually able to help you make meaning of this in a beautiful way.
struck by how the Buddha spoke about the mind that's unified as malleable and workable and luminous, and just it's beautiful to see these different concepts just reflected in the research that you're talking about and the kind of careful framing. So
and maybe one last word before we move to the questions, as like while I'm not doing Paoxayad or jhanas in the most advanced ways, and while I'm a lay practitioner myself, at the end, what I find beautiful is where the theory and the conversations around this meet the practice, right? And in some ways, I feel like what I really am is I'm a Buddhist meditator and drag as a scientist, trying to this is the way that makes it easiest for me to engage with these practices. And with that, it's with huge gratitude to have these conversations in a space with you as practitioners and with a larger community where these conversations are actually inspiring practice and in some beautiful ways.
Yeah, and it is appreciated how open you are in this conversation, actually talking about your own meditation practice in your talk at Oxford, which I think we'll put a link to. And you've got a picture of you meditating. I mean, it's possible, 30, 40 years ago, there would be some stigma to, to a researcher actually divulging that personal aspect. But science of the first person. So first question is it possible to correlate and I think these are your words, the quote, brain expending energy anticipating what we see to the action effect of our sankharas? This is the Pali for mental formations.
Again, there's a subtle part where I think sankharas is a word that seems to carry a lot of meaning, and I might not be able to grasp the completeness of what that really means. And yet there's one part that seems central to sankharas, which is certain experiences and habits and actions we've done in the past influencing the future. And the idea is that in deep meditation, we notice these sankharas arise and notice these urges and habits and intrusive thoughts and maybe violent thoughts or things that are actually not helpful. And that what meditation is to sit with these and allow them to dissipate over time. And if that's the way we think of sankharas, then I think they're perfectly explained with this predictive processing framework. It's sankharas are habits that we've been entrained over time in the past in a context that maybe wasn't ideal for us to develop the most beautiful way of relating to the world. And what we do in meditation is we notice these patterns and we slowly transform them and let go of them.
That's wonderful. And it strikes me that, just as you talked about the anticipation being the primary element in some sense, on dependent origination, sankhara precedes everything except ignorance. So Deborah has a question. How do you distinguish the results of jhana from the results of having a daily Dhamma practice, which usually goes along with jhana practice?
Well, ultimately, that's a hard thing to study, right? It's very, very hard to have. It's easy to find people that meditate a lot but don't do jhana practice. It's hard or impossible to find jhana meditators that don't meditate a lot. It's slightly hard to distinguish the two. And there's always two types of effects that we distinguish in research. There's the state and there's the trait. And so the trait is something like a certain quality that is long-lasting. And most meditators, if you meditate over multiple years, you start developing a certain trait characteristic that is just always there. And then the state is what are you doing moment to moment? And so all the research that I've been doing is, it's given that you are a meditator, given that you have a state of heightened concentration and heightened metacognition, how is that state now refined when you do jhana practice compared to other practice? So it's my research is amongst these few people that have meditate so much, how is the specific practice slightly different? And And this is slightly different from taking a bunch of meditators and comparing them to people that have never meditated. I think those questions are really interesting as well. There's been lots of research on it, and I think really beautiful results. And I think now with this new wave, it's not me. There's also other people doing this research on more refined states of meditation. It's like now teasing apart how are these different states of meditation slightly different, and acknowledging that meditation is not equal meditation. And so it's like now, just starting from a different group and teasing apart the different practices there.
So our next question, how unique are jhāna mind states neurologically? Are there other experiences that show similar MRI patterns to someone in jhāna? Could you tell whether or not someone is truly in jhāna just by MRI, EEG?
Yeah. So 2 parts, right? How unique are these states? So we already talked about psychedelics, where like some of the findings are a bit similar to psychedelics. Then they're not the same, right? But there's certain characteristics that are the same. And can we reliably predict whether someone is in jhāna or not? Not quite yet. So basically what it takes to be able to make these predictions is to have scanned a lot of people and find underlying current patterns. Like these percentages are basically random, but I would say like 95% of what's happening in the brain is just basic activity that is trying to keep the brain alive and trying to keep kind of functioning of the brain alive. And it's only like really a few percent that are slightly different between different states of consciousness. And so to get really clear on these subtle difference between what jhāna is and what other states are, we just need a lot of data to get really, really good results. It's just like normal brain data is super noisy, and so we just need loads of data. And so we're now slowly in the first stages of getting some hints. Do we see a tendency? We definitely see a tendency. There's more entropy, there's more flexibility. We see in brain waves, there's a lot more like high frequency brain waves that are indicative of increased states of attention. Do we have good enough of a picture that we could reliably say whether someone is in jhāna or not? So basically train a classifier? Not yet. I think in principle that will be possible, but at the moment we need the practitioner to tell us whether they are in jhāna or not. And the science is not yet far enough to have authority to kind of replace that subjective report.
So in that case, this question may be just one step further in a realm you already said you're hitting an asymptote in, but still, do you see quantas or steps of minimum entropy that could correlate with different jhāna levels? And just in general, yes, have you seen differences in the different jhanas as you have practitioners moving through them?
Yeah. So yes. Yes is the answer. There's a paper published by a collaborator of ours. His name is Matthew Sakat. He is at Harvard, and he also works with jhāna practitioners in a different lineage. And he has been he was able to train a classifier to very reliably distinguish the different jhanas. And he has been able to train this classifier based on the frequency power distribution, which is indicative of most like how attention and other brain cognitive functions work. In our data, what we see very focused specifically on this entropy measure, this measure of like malleability of the brain, that this measure goes increasingly up as the jhanas deepen. So this is like a bit vague, but basically what we find is that what we see in the first jhana is deepening as the jhanas go on. So we see more and more malleability, and it's especially for jhana 4. So the first 3 jhanas are somewhat similar, and then it's jhana 4 that kind of sticks out as having another stronger drop in intensity. Again, it's not yet good enough to be able to predict the differences, but yes, there is a trend where they are different and significantly different.
Mhm.
How close do you think we are to actually having biofeedback mechanisms or biofeedback, that can actually train us so we can see these different markers and actually help train ourselves into jhāna?
Yeah, there is effort that is trying to get this biofeedback question solved. In particular, in San Francisco, there's a company called Journey. A few years back, I was quite connected with them to think about what this would be like, and then decided to focus a bit more on the research with kind of these practitioners and lineages, because I think we just need to learn more from practitioners. It's not yet a pure math problem. There's something that's a more experiential problem. So I think there's two questions. How soon are we to be able to predict these states and give biofeedback? I don't think we were very, very far from that. I think it's a matter of a couple of years until we get that figured out. And I think it will just be a matter of who is setting enough resources and time at it. Right? Like who will take the time to collect enough data and just train these models. So that, I think, is not so far into the future. How long will it take until this neurofeedback will actually help us to train these states and advance our deepening these states, make them quicker, accessible? I think that's a much bigger question, where what I said at the beginning is one way to perceive of jhāna is as the gold state. And if it's like just getting jhanas going, I think that we can do pretty good with neurofeedback. But if we want to take jhanas as an indicator that there's some other development of deepening other qualities, and jhana is an indicator that just shows us how strongly have we developed these other qualities. In that case, meditation becomes a much more complex phenomena. And when not many, but there's a few people that I work with one-on-one to speak through their practice and try to kind of use what I do in the sciences to kind of coach them through a more mechanistic way of developing these practices. And what it comes back to in the end, very, very often, is it's not a single object focus, which neurofeedback would target it, but it's a pretty, the trick is to distribute efforts in the right way, the right efforts for how much effort to sit, how much concentration, how to toggle all these other factors of how much joy should I allow, when is joy and pity too distracting. So it's like it's a fine tuning of these different states. And while I hope we find a technological solution that can help with this part, I'm yet not sure if that will be possible or if that will actually distract from the complexity that this task is inherently.
Thank you for taking all these questions, Jonas. They just keep popping up. On the
Great.
note of kind of skillful means or biofeedback, etc., or technological kind of shortcuts, I'm curious about your thoughts on binaural beats in various brainwaves. Thank you.
Yeah, same. I think it's very similar to the question that just came. Binaural beats and other neurofeedback practices, will they have pretty strong impact on consciousness? Yes, they will. How helpful is it to actually develop a consciousness that has some more beautiful qualities? I think that's a slightly different question that again requires having context of community, having feedback of the people around you, and one of the problems I see with much of the neurofeedback and binaural beats and whatever you can think of is that the target of what you're trying to optimize is more and more the individual. Yes, I do think the individual is a very central part in the development of insight and awakening, but it's not isolating the individual. Ultimately, what we want to do is develop a quality that allows us to be more in connection with others. And maybe more than ever, like this is going a bit further from the question, but I think it's an important point. we're in this place where I like this term meta-modern, meta-thinking a lot, where it's not only about optimizing ourselves, but it's how can we both develop beautiful qualities, but then also feel this deep connection to society at large with all kinds of different polarized opinions and kind of internationally with different countries and nations. And like, how do we develop this awareness of being a collective, like a sentient being, like a human creature? And I think these developing certain states can be really helpful for that. But I think being mindful of the impact that this has is probably equally important than the individual states that we develop. And so with that, yes, there's a lot of technology that helps us to get certain states, but how do these momentary states translate into traits that are more long-lasting? That, I think, is a process that takes a little bit more time, and one that I think can't be solved with like a button click. Yet there is the hope. I still do very much have the hope that we solve this. I think when the neuroscience involves far enough to kind of figure out what it means to tap in these deeper spaces, but we're only at the beginning of that journey yet. And yeah, I think there's more to come.
So I understand that bliss is considered a strong marker of a jhāna state. That's right. During your interviews with the study participants, do they mention bliss? And just my own question, I mean, I remember hearing you speak about this in particular, and just the phrase bone-breaking bliss, or how do you have a scale? Are there already tested scales for measuring happiness? And I just imagine that jhāna must be off the charts of such a scale.
I love that. So we have a scale that is asking, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much pity do you experience? Which, well, it's made for these meditators, and the scale, of course, it's adapted to their range. So if they say I feel a 2 of pity, it might be like a 95% of what humanity feels. So that's a difficult comparison. So that being said, is there how do people talk about it? So it's one of the most stunning moments of these interviews when people talk about what is bliss or pity for them. And one participant used the words like you mentioned this. It was like bone-shattering intensity. I wasn't able to contain it. It was so, like, every time I closed my eyes, there was just this intense joy. So yes, there is, and that for me is the stunning part. These practices can unlock states of experience that are so utterly different to ordinary kind of the mundane of everyday life. And yet, that is something Shaila Catherine emphasizes. It's not of like increasing the bliss. What you really want to do is to notice the bliss, but then also be able to let go of it and not get so attached to it. And that's where the bliss becomes so intense that you notice it's not really the bliss that I want. I want the peace behind it. That's really what I want. And that's where the interesting refinement comes. And like, you easily equated happiness with bliss. And I think the question would be, if people go along this path, how is their definition of happiness changing? And I think that might be a journey from having a bit of quiet of mind to then happiness being the ecstatic bliss, to then happiness being the quiet after the bliss, to maybe there's more stages to come.
So Jonas, we should move over to Zoom in a second, but I did want to just finish with one question to kind of, I think it's a beautiful one. How is this journey through, this research and being with these practitioners, how has it affected your own faith, your own spiritual path? What is your relationship to the Buddha and the Dhamma?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. It's an intimate question.
And the Sangha, that
Yeah, it's I started my research a couple of years back with the idea of I just want to figure out what these mechanisms are underlying all these practices. And the more I know these mechanisms, the better I can practice it myself, the better I can teach it to others, and the problem and the mystery of consciousness is solved. That wasn't quite as easy of a path. The more I studied these states, the more I noticed the edges where we actually don't yet know how to explain these states. The more mystery and magic came in. Like there is this bliss and pity arising in people, sometimes in me. Where is that coming from? What does it mean? And sure, I can explain mechanisms, and sure, I can give mechanisms for others to kind of do things that increases the likelihood that this happens. It's just like it's a chance game. I can do the mechanistic things that the chance of experiencing these things are just a bit higher. If I meditate 2-3 hours a day, the chance is a bit higher than if I meditate 5 minutes a day. Sure. And yet it didn't fill or like saturate my hunger for understanding these things. And in an interesting way, there is more and more faith that has grown along my studies. So the more science I was doing, the more the faith grew, where there was a sense of, yes, I get the mechanics, but what's this more? What's the beauty of it? And I think this is kind of a personal view, but for me, faith is not something that stands contrary to these mechanisms. It's not, I have faith because I'm not able to explain something. It's faith into the inherent beauty of these mechanisms. Like how beautiful is that these complex computational mechanisms of neurons, that they don't just compute data, but how beautiful that they feel like something, that they feel so beautiful as they do. And it's in that where there's like these little moments in the morning and evening, just have gratitude that a consciousness and phenomenology feels like something, and that me and us have the chance to experience this. And I think there's something around that, faith and beauty, and with that also prayer. There's something I think the Christians get right, and a certain prayer and devotion, which also I think we in the Buddhist community have, which it's a beautiful practice.
Jonas, this has been such a pleasure. And we just pasted the Zoom link for a session, which Jonas will be joining us for at least some of into the chat. If you don't see it there, you can go to clearmountainmonastery.org. Halfway down the page, you'll find a Wednesday evening live stream event listing with the Zoom link there. And yeah, feel free to join for a more intimate discussion. But just to wrap things up, Jonas, we really value and appreciate the research that you're doing. We appreciate Ajahn Sadaro for putting us in contact, and your humility, care, and gratitude for these ancient traditions, while also bringing a really important perspective and rigor to them, is just so appreciated. So if you ever come by Seattle, please drop in to Clearmountain. We would love to see you.
So good. Thank you so much for having me.
You can experience our metacognition like this.
Nice. The oldest Buddhist pun in the world, but still good.